So I guess the thing I need to do is I need to answer this question. Is Adirondack old growth forest important for Lake Champlain Health? Yes. Now we can go to the reflection. Let's do this. Yeah, that's a very short and very glib answer to a very complex question. We know that undisturbed forest is the best landscape form for producing water that has sediments and dissolved nutrients that are within healthy tolerances for downstream receiving waters and to provide consistent flow of cool water. We know that. I think lake health can be a subjective concept. It depends on the water body and human perceptions and desires for use of that water body. Is a small, highly productive, warm water pond healthy? It might be choked with vegetation unsuitable for swimming and even wading. But I would suggest that it also may be a vibrant and complex community of organisms that are doing just fine. Our perceptions color our views. Large water bodies like Lake Champlain are more complex, with larger watersheds full of different kinds of land uses, a bathymetry that has deep and shallow areas, multiple inflowing tributaries, exposure to wind. I would say that a healthy Lake Champlain has water chemistry conditions suitable for sustaining its assembly of native species. I think that condition relies on continued, consistent input of water that is cool in temperature and low in total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and suspended solids and other pollutants. It also relies on protection from invasive species. The connector here is water, of course. You understand that. Water is the driver in all of the systems that we're talking about. There's an extensive body of research that clearly shows that watersheds with higher forest or other natural community fractions produce outflowing water that is lower in total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and suspended solids, and produces consistent flow volumes and lower water temperatures than watersheds with a higher fraction of agriculture or development. This is nothing new, and I don't mean to call down on any particular land use. Some might say we have to take the bad with the good with the bad, and I get that. However, there are things we can do to maximize the ability of our watersheds to produce high quality water. First, obviously, is to protect and enhance intact forest in the watershed. Second, we can focus those efforts on critical parts of the watershed, specifically shoreline and shoreland zones along surface water courses. It's not just how much intact forest there is in the watershed, it's where that forest is located. I suspect that if we were able to ring every surface water body with an intact forest buffer, we would eventually see decreases in total nitrogen, total phosphorus, suspended solids entering the lake. It's a very simplified view. It does not account for point sources that can be tremendous sources of pollutants. So the slide I showed you, what is old growth forest? The question is, what is old growth forest? I mean, you use the
Look
term.
at the size of that tree.
Say again? There's background music. It's nice. Oh, I see. Okay. So what is old growth forest? I saw a talk by Neil Peterson a couple of weeks back. I think you remember that, Peter. And he said he was tired of discussing old growth definitions. He said that old growth forest is about time and processes. It's not a destination. And I kind of agree with that. Think about what this land was like 14,000 years ago. Approximately 14,000, give or take 1,000. The great ice sheets had melted. Large chunks of ice were still to be found throughout the landscape of the Lake Champlain watershed. Much of the mineral soil sediments were probably colonized by graminoids rather than trees. It was a tundra landscape. Post-glacial erosion was taking place after the ice wasted, but before the landscape was forested. So from Steve Jackson's research in the Adirondacks, we know that there was a succession of tree species that colonized these deglaciated areas. Tundra species gave way to spruce fir forests. Some of that spruce fir has persisted until now at high elevations and on low, wet, cold flats. On deeper, better drained and more fertile soils, spruce fir gave way to northern hardwoods, sugar maple, beech, yellow birch, some white pine, hemlock, red spruce. Within 1,000 years of glacial wasting, that is from 1,000 years from when the ice left the landscape, the forest had moved in, and the original forests that were there at that time, they remained intact, at least in the central Adirondacks, until European colonization in the 1700s. So we had this landscape that became forested and remained intact in the central Adirondacks until European colonization in the 1700s. We know that Paleo-Indians had an extensive and long-term presence in the central Adirondacks. Everybody always used to say, oh, they just moved through, they were just hunting, and they traveled, they were trying to get to nicer places, better places for fishing and hunting and warmer temperature. Well, projectile points found near Tupper Lake date back to over 10,000 years. Cooking stones, hearths, and pottery dating to that time period have also been found. This type and amount of living equipment means that those people were here living and working in this landscape for long periods over a very long time. However, unlike the Champlain Valley and the Catskills, it doesn't appear as if those folks utilized fire as a tool to manipulate forest composition to any great extent. There is some evidence that burning by indigenous people was commonplace and widespread in the Champlain Valley, beginning around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. This was not just an occasional spot fire here and there. These were widespread, coalescing, and overlapping landscape fires that we think were repeatedly set for centuries and perhaps even millennia. Apparently, these folks manipulated the landscape with fire. Sure.
Sorry for the slides didn't get shared.
You know, years ago, they had things called carousel projectors. That dates all of us in this room. Everybody's laughing. You know.
Slideshow.
Slideshow, exactly.
Ryan, how do I get this top article?
We didn't get voices coming out of them.
But having said that, the Zoom is a great tool. I gave a Learn 10 Trees course out of the Wild Center in Tupper Lake during the COVID. You know, nobody could meet. So I went to the Wild Center. They set up with the camera and everything. And for 3 weeks, I did 3 one-hour presentations on how to identify trees. There's 125 people that had dialed in. And they said they got something out of it. So to reach that many people was fantastic.
All right, we're back in business, thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna have that up there then? It's okay. Okay, so let's go back here. Oh, I guess in forward this already. Yeah, okay. So apparently these folks manipulated the landscape with fire for agricultural purposes to clear land, food crop enhancement for berries and mass bearing trees, better hunting, defense, and better travel. Their efforts have led to the presence and or predominance of southern hardwoods, oaks and hickories. From the western shores of Lake Champlain into the high peaks to around Keene Valley. So if you go above Keene Valley, if you look at this map, you can see these dots here. This is where red oak has been sampled and found in, and you can see it's more or less in the Champlain Valley. Here's Keene Valley here. There's a few outlying dots, but they may have been planted, or there may have been a stray blue jay that coughed up an acorn someplace. But the predominance of oaks were in the Champlain Valley, not in the central Adirondacks. And the reason for that, we think, is because this landscape has been burnt over and over and over again to allow mass-bearing trees to come into the landscape.
Are the dots representing an individual tree or?
Yeah, but it could be a whole stand. It's just a location, that's all. So I'd like you to also focus on the preponderance of black dots here that are associated with the Champlain Valley. And this is location of parcels of land in agricultural use in 2007. Look where they are. It's all in the Champlain Valley. There's nothing in it. You really can't grow much except potatoes in the central Adirondack. That's an exaggeration, but this is the traditional farming lands, and that's where and the reason for that, because the soils are more fertile, it's a little bit warmer. Okay, so fire and clearing accelerated in the last 3.5 centuries since European colonization. What the native peoples had done as their agricultural areas, the Europeans then continued and broadened later on. So this is a map showing land cover in the Adirondacks. And it gives you a perspective here. You can see that there are, there's different color, mostly it's green, mostly hardwood forest, but these areas here, this dark green and this yellow area, step over here, the yellow area and the lighter colors, and then the dark green. So this is agriculture and human development along the west coast of Lake Champlain. Whereas up here, this is the watershed, this is the Osceola watershed and the Saranac further up. You can see that that indeed, even though there is a lot of development in the valley, the upper watershed has intact forests. That dark green are conifer forests at the highest elevations. So in summary, the watershed of Lake Champlain in New York State can be divided into two distinct sections. The upper watershed contains the headwaters of major rivers flowing to Lake Champlain and the most old intact forest. This area was for the most part not manipulated by fire by indigenous people, but was cleared for limited agriculture, lumbering, and charcoal by European colonizers. The forest cover is generally intact and for the most part reflects the suite of species naturally present as part of successional trends since the last ice age. There is evidence that the lower watershed was for the most part burned by native people for a variety of reasons and for centuries, perhaps millennia. That widespread disturbance has continued over the last 3.5 centuries by colonists of European descent for agriculture, charcoal, and lumbering. The forest at these lower elevations is not as intact. The suite of species reflects the history of continued manipulation. One might suggest that it would be better for lake water quality if the watershed sections were reversed, so that the intact forest was down lower in the watershed, so it could attempt to treat the waters flowing from the upper watershed before it entered a receiving water body. Well, the fact is that the better soils are lower down, the agricultural areas are lower down. That's where people from 6,000 to 7,000 years ago to present have colonized and decreased the intactness of the forest, fragmented it, and changed its composition. So I think you're getting the idea now that the old growth forest is only one phase of a forest's life, and that intact forest is more important as a designation as it affects water quality. To some extent, it doesn't matter if it's old growth or not, as long as it is intact for water quality. Now, having said that, old growth forest provides other ecological services that young forests just don't provide. But when we're talking about water quality, as long as the forest is intact and that it's not getting ripped up, it's not getting disturbed or cut off to any great extent, that's important for water quality. So that's the process: colonization by plants after deglaciation, natural successional changes occurring through the millennia, resulting in forest tracts of varying composition and structure. Human manipulation overlaid on all to varying degrees. What about the old growth forest of today? What is it? What does it look like? When I walk into a forest, how do I make an old growth determination? How do I say, oh, this is an old growth forest? That requires some kind of description. I won't call it a definition, but I'll call it a description. So old growth forests growing at high, mid, and low elevations can outwardly be quite different also. And I'll try to explain that as we go on. So old growth forests at low and mid elevations have large old trees. Large old trees, that's large and old. Because you can have large trees that aren't very old at all. We want large and old trees. So here's a hemlock that's 37 plus inches in diameter. Judging by you can't see the top of this tree, but looking at the entirety of the tree, we judge that it's probably about 300 years old, 250 to 300 years old. Eastern white pine, here's a 45-inch white pine that can be very deceptive. White pine is especially, to me, is very deceptive. I've seen, and I've cored white pine that are 36 inches plus in diameter, only 170 years old. So they can grow really fast and get big real quick. This one, looking at the top of it, it looked to me like it was probably maybe 250, maybe 300. That's good growth for a 45-inch diameter tree. And sugar maple is another big one. This one is 40.6 inches in diameter. A massive tree. And judging by the bark, you can see the bark how it's gotten kind of flaky. And looking at the top of the tree, this tree I would say is at least 300 years old, maybe 3¼ maybe 350. A lot of the dates, a lot of the ages of trees that we've come to recognize, people say, oh, hemlock is 300, it'll grow to be 350 years old. Well, we found trees that have been a lot older than that. So we've had to revise our thinking about the actual old age date of trees. But when you look at the tree and it's columnar rather than taper, and it's got a scraggly top, and you look at the bark and you look at the buttressing of the trunk, you can get an idea that, yeah, this is not just a big, fast-growing tree. This is a big old tree. Old growth forests also have standing dead snags, which are really important for wildlife. Their pileated woodpeckers work this over pretty well, and they're going after ants and other insects inside the wood, but they're also leaving places for other organisms to have shelter. So they're doing, so the snags are really important in old growth forests, and that's one of the things that you would expect to see in an old growth forest. Another is coarse woody debris, CWD, as they say in the literature. CWD, coarse woody debris. These big old trees, these are all, and look, they're all flowing in one direction. They're all lying in one direction too, which tells me it probably was wind that knocked them all down at the same time. But in any case, coarse woody debris, big chunks of wood lying on the forest floor, habitat for all kinds of organisms, bryophytes growing on top of them, recycling nutrients slowly back into the soil. That's old growth. Pit and mound topography. When you have a blowdown, you've got this tipped up root wad, and you can see here, it's got a yellow birch growing out of the root wad of this hemlock that's been laying on the ground for probably 40, 50 years. Trees maybe 35, 40 years old. When the hemlock fell down, it raised this root wad, the birch colonized it, raised the root wad, but it also made a divot in the back. It made a pit. So we got pit and mound topography. I mean, these next slides are going to drive you crazy. Okay. So this is a LiDAR shot from Heaven Hill in Lake Placid. And it's a forested area and also ag area. And you can see the ag is nice and smooth. It's almost as if somebody went through and ironed it. Well, they didn't iron it. They actually went through with plow and a rake and harrow and cultivators, and they've flattened out that land. When you strip away the vegetation, when you strip away this forest cover, now you're left with this. Looks like a moonscape. And the clarity, I know the clarity probably isn't great for you folks, but take my word, if you can't see it really clearly. This is just pocked with pits and mounds. This is what a northern hardwood forest should look like that hasn't been fooled around with in a long period of time. If you go into, you can see the smooth here, this has been cultivated, pit and mound here. If you go into a forest in the northeast and you don't see pit and mound topography, you can be pretty well guaranteed that somebody's been in there with a plow and they flattened it all out. They cut the trees off, grubbed the stumps, and they flattened it all out. Sure.
Clarifying, it's LiDAR image, and then it's been filtered so that the pitted and mounded area where the forest exists. So the LiDAR has, to the surface, kind of eliminated the trees.
Correct.
So we're looking at
That's right.
essentially the surface.
That's right. So the first image was the LiDAR that was looking at treetop level. And then the second one was looking at ground level with the trees removed. Phenomenal tool. And this just blows my mind. I mean, to see that's pretty cool. See that pit and mound topography like that in adjacent to this smoother landscape. That reflects the land use. That's what it is. Okay. Also, gaps where large trees, like this big yellow birch, look at the crown of that yellow birch. It's probably got a spread of 50 feet, maybe 60 feet. And when it dies, it's gonna leave this big open spot in the forest. And just like over here, you can see that these trees died, either blown over or died and fell down, left this gap, and now what's coming up in yellow birch? You know, more yellow birch, looks like maybe a sugar maple back here. Smaller, younger trees growing up in the gap. So we've got old trees, we've got young trees, we've got these gaps that are filling up with volunteer species. Because we've got an old growth forest is a forest of all age classes. A lot of times people think, oh, old growth forest, it's it's these big columns, like you're going into a cathedral and everything is hushed and it's dark and shaded. That's kind of a mature forest, not really old growth forest, unless it's showing some of these characteristics. Old growth forest is a lot messier. It's got big old trees. There's some big old trees here. It's got younger trees intermixed. It's got saplings. It's got some seedlings. It's got this coarse woody debris on the forest floor. It's a mishmash of stuff. That's a really healthy forest. I know people like to clean forests up like this, and it kind of drives me crazy, but to me, this is the way a natural forest that hasn't seen the hand of man for many, many years would look like. I took that photo. It's a darn good photo. Okay. So in addition to the structural diversity that we see in the forest canopy, there's also structural diversity on the stem of the trees. You can see the bryophytes clinging to that white ash over there, and then on the forest floor, bryophytes on the forest floor with boulders and all kinds of different levels of vegetation and structure. Here's another example of structure that we don't see very often. This is a sugar maple that blew down. And when I looked at the top of the tree, it's encrusted with epiphytes. I mean, you think about, you go to Florida and you see the bromeliads growing in the palm trees and, you know, all Spanish moss hanging in northern hardwood forest. It's coated with bryophytes and lichens also. Phenomena which we don't get to see very often. These forests typically show the effects of natural factors such as blowdown and wind throw, lightning caused fires, landslides, floods. Human set fires, logging, road building have also affected the old growth that we see today, but in most cases, the evidence of them is lacking because it took place so long ago. So where are these old growth forests? There are actually some in places that you would not expect, since they could have been easily reached by loggers. Barbara McMartin posits in her book, The Great Forest of the Adirondacks, that there may be as much as 500,000 acres, 500,000 acres of old growth forest in the entire Adirondack Park. But she doesn't tease out exactly what is existing within the watersheds contributing to Lake Champlain. Much of it was inaccessible, such as the spruce fir forest above 2,500 feet in elevation. These areas above 2,500 were never logged. So those are first growth, the virgin forest, never logged, and they are old growth too. But they don't look like the old growth forest I just showed you photos of. There aren't any big old trees because there are fewer species. But these forests are prone to mortality because of shallow soils, infertile soils, freezing temperatures, incredibly freezing wind. So all those factors reduce the structural diversity. It's a more, what do I want to say? It's a less diverse, structurally diverse system. I consider it old growth because it's as old as it can be, given the environmental conditions in which it grows. And the fact that it's been there since the glaciers left 14,000 years ago. Think about it. Those forests up top have never seen the hand of man except acid deposition. They've never been cut over. Some of them have been burnt, but probably by lightning fires, natural disturbance. Blown down, yeah, perhaps. But they've evolved over the last 10, 12, 13,000 years. They really haven't changed much in that period of time. Okay, so in the Lake Champlain watershed, those elevations above 2,500 feet are forested and occupy the headwaters of the Saranac, Boquet, and Osable rivers as old growth intact forests. Why am I spending so much time on this distinction? Because much of the forest and the watersheds contributing to Lake Champlain above 2,500 feet elevation. And McMartin does report on some logging that went on up to 3,100 feet in the Osable River watershed. But that was like a one-time situation. Those are intact forests. And as noted previously, intact forest is probably just as important as old growth when it comes to providing the ecological service of water quality protection. And remember, if intact forest isn't old growth now, it will become old growth someday, if you leave it alone. This is a map from 1891 when they were talking about creating an Adirondack Park, which you see here. That was the Adirondack Park in 1892 when they actually created it. But I show you this map because, and I focus on this part, which is really more or less the Osable Boquet drainage and Saranac drainage. This is Elizabethtown right here. The Boquet River coming out of Elizabethtown. As you can see, the green is virgin forest, what they're calling virgin forest at that time, never been logged. The orange are denuded areas. And the white is listed as region in which the valleys are occupied by farms and the hills mostly covered with second growth hardwoods, seldom large. So you can see that the Champlain Valley was heavily used back in the day. And the central Adirondacks was not, it was relatively intact. And the good news about that is that this portion of it is still in the lake, was in the Lake Champlain watershed, and still is, and contributes to water quality in that regard. Then remember, we've had 30 years since McMartin wrote her book, 1994. So 30 more years of growth, additional forest age, growth, and ecological processes. How much is actually in the watershed? Nobody really knows. Nobody's taken the time to, and it's very difficult to tease out that information. So this is a copy of a portion of the Adirondack Park Land Use and Development Plan map showing the Sable and Bocat watersheds. And I think the best we can do as far as trying to figure out how much is in the watershed now, the amount of forest reserve, is to look at the amount of forest preserved land as a percentage of the watershed. The watersheds of the Saranac, Chazy, Sable, Bocat, and Lake George have about 1.5 million acres within the blue line of the Adirondack Park. Of that, approximately 46%, around 659,000 acres, are protected forest preserved lands. Of the watersheds, of those watersheds, only the Bocat and Sable have substantial farmland, approximately 20,000 acres. The bulk of all the watersheds is forest. Forest management, including cuts of varying intensity and size, occur at random temporal intervals and geographic scales on the private lands. What about the other forests and land uses in the watershed? Well, even though approximately 46% of these watersheds are forest preserve, not all of it is old growth. But based on what I've said previously regarding impacts to water quality, just about any intact forest will do. So those intact forests, by definition, forest preserve is pretty intact forest. They will do. They will serve. It doesn't need to be old growth, although old growth provides other ecosystem services that younger forests don't. Other land uses include agriculture and human infrastructure development, both of which contribute total nitrogen, total phosphorus, suspended solids far in excess of that produced by old growth forest or intact forest. Even though New York State has been going through a period of reforestation in rural areas, the Adirondack Park, along with Casco Park and Allegheny State Park, are the most densely forested and least inhabited parts of the state. And the Adirondacks has by far the most acreage of old growth forest. Okay. What are the threats to the old growth forest? This is a graphic that shows you the size of the Adirondack Park in relationship to the rest of the state. Fully 1/5 of the land area of New York is within the Adirondack Park. So New York's in the unique position of having constitutional protection of its state-owned land. Europeans did not colonize the Champlain Valley to any great extent until after the French and Indian War. By the 1770s, there were substantial agricultural communities along the west coast of Lake Champlain. It wasn't until the 1840s, 1850s that people began to settle the central Adirondacks. It wasn't until 1859 that Paul Smith built his famous hotel on Lower St. Regis Lake. So those were all latecomers to the scene. Much of the state-owned land had been divided into large patents and sold to would-be developers for pennies on the acre. Many attempts at selling farmers on the land were tried, and many of them failed. Some of the land was cut over for eastern white pine and then red spruce because you could float those downstream in the abundant rivers, lakes, and ponds that were found in the Adirondacks. But extensive hardwood logging didn't take place in the central Adirondacks until the late 1890s, when railroads were shunted into the central Adirondacks. Before that, there was not much hardwood removal. In the central Adirondacks, Champlain Valley, yes, they were charcoaling like crazy down here in the 1800s, and they denuded the land around Mariah in that particular area. Okay, so in 1885, New York State legislature designated all state-owned lands as forest preserve, which gave the state authority to protect the forests thereon. In 1892, the Adirondack Park was created by legislative action. And as early as 1868, Vermont Colvin, who was the surveyor of the central Adirondacks, publicly advocated for preservation of the region as a state park. So if you look at this graphic, it shows you what the park looked like in 1892 when they created it. This is the blue line in 1892. This is the blue line now. 1971, they expanded the park, almost doubled its size. The other thing to look at in this graphic is the forest preserve lands in 1892 in the Champlain Valley. These dark green areas are forest preserve lands, pretty scattered, not much of it. But now look, the light green is forest preserve lands as of 2017. A lot more forest preserve land now, presently in the Champlain Valley. So I would argue that, I don't know, argue, but I would say that that because that forest preserve land is there now, and there's a lot of it, and it's protected. So there will be no logging, there will be no cutting of timber on it. We will have, if it's not intact forest now, it will be intact forest in a short period of time, maybe tomorrow. That's going to be, that's a good thing for water quality in Lake Champlain.
Is that like land trusts? Do they count in there for the? Park?
No, this is just state land.
Just state.
So
Okay.
I cut, this is way too long, so I cut slides out. I did have a slide showing easement lands. And you can access that, access it on the APA website. If you go to their website and go to their map section, there's a graphic in there that shows easement lands, at least as maybe up to 2018 in the entire park. So that would be in addition. In 1895, Article 14 of the Constitution was enacted. I love Article 14. The famous Forever Wild Clause. This was done primarily to protect the forest from uncontrolled logging pressures and to provide flood control and water for downstate receiving works, canals especially. Canals were big back then, at that time, for moving freight and commercial uses. Not so much now anymore, but that was a big impetus to locking up the Adirondack Park and protecting the forests with the Forever Wild Clause. So Article 14 states in part, the lands of the state now owned or hereafter acquired, constituting the forest preserve as now fixed by law, shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, public or private, nor powerful, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. That's very powerful language. Shows a tremendous amount of foresight and resolve. 1895. They could actually get things done in legislature back then. That says the temporary study commission in the Adirondack Park Agency Act. So that protected forest reserve lands. But protection via regulation of development activities didn't come about on privately held lands until the creation of the Adirondack Park Agency through legislation in 1971. Since then, activities on private lands, including clear cuts greater than 25 acres in size, have had review by the Adirondack Park Agency. In addition to creation of the APA Act of 1971 increased the size of the park, extending it all the way to Lake Champlain, and put in place private and public land use plans that help guide land use. What is the condition of the old growth forest that we have now? What are the threats? Generally, old growth forest in the Adirondacks is in good condition. At least those portions that are in forest reserve have had little hands-on management for the last 150 years or so. Old growth forest and its mature forest precursors on private lands have been and continue to be under threat from timber harvesting and other management schemes. So managed forests today, but having said that, managed forests today are managed a lot better than they used to be. It used to be just about only logger's choice. Loggers would come in, got what they wanted, and leave whatever they wanted. Long-term forest managers realize that future returns, either from harvest or land sale, are dependent on the quality of the actions they take today. However, timber harvesting continues to fragment our forests, and there are there are consequences for that. Environmental groups that are actively advocating for intact forest politically, and some are purchasing land in fee or purchasing easements that would restrict active management of intact forests and allow impacted forests to heal. So Adirondack Land Trust is one of those entities. Nature Conservancy is another one of those entities that is buying up land or putting easements on land to protect those forests. Although active management is not allowed on the forest preserve, over the last 100+ years, the old growth forest has had to deal with chestnut blight. There was and still is American chestnut in at least the Lake George and probably in the Au watershed drainage. Dutch elm disease, beech bark disease, now beech leaf disease, hemlock woolly adelgid, Asian longhorn. Well, we don't have Asian longhorn beetle, thank goodness, but it's probably just a matter of time. As well as a host of invasive plant species. Acid deposition and mercury mobilization are problems also. And finally, climate disruption is engulfing everything in a mantle of uncertainty. Changes in temperature and moisture amount and seasonality will have significant impacts on the forests that are very difficult to predict. Probably maybe impossible to predict. So what can we do? Well, we can reduce our own individual personal carbon footprint and advocate for carbon reductions politically. We can support organizations that advocate for forest protection and serve as watchdogs of public agencies and private interests. And believe me, as being from a public agency, they do require watchdog. Learn as much as you can about forests and the components and their components. That is, we go to talks like this, get some books, get some good book. Read Barbara Martin's book. It's a really interesting book. You can do it. You can do it. And then I would say, lastly, walk in amongst the trees.
Can you hug the trees?
As much as you want, and they will give you much in return. So that's all I have for tonight. If anybody has any questions? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about where we're at with red spruce, in terms of how it was affected by acid rain, and if they're coming back, or did we lose a bunch of red spruce?
At high elevations, red spruce definitely was impacted, and a lot of it was from nitrogen deposition. That is, it was fertilized, over fertilized, and so its hardening off period was stretched out to an extent where it didn't harden off before winters, cold temperatures came on and froze the new growth. So that was one impact of red spruce. From my perspective, looking at the red spruce now in the forest, it's doing pretty good. A lot of reproduction. In fact, I was noting to a friend the other day, and I've been looking at this more, and you can look at it yourself. Go into a hemlock grove. A lot of these trees, like hemlock, is probably the most shade tolerant tree we have in the northeastern forest. So everybody always says, well, hemlock can reproduce under its own shade. There's not much that reproduces under hemlock, and I haven't seen hardly any hemlock reproducing under its own shade. I see red spruce reproducing under its shade, which is really cool. Red spruce is also a very shade tolerant species. So I'm digressing, I'm going all over the place here, but the red spruce that I see looks in pretty good shape, and there's a lot of reproduction out there, at least in the forest that I'm going into in the Adirondacks. It's an interesting forest that now that you got me on red spruce now. Red spruce is one of the early trees to be harvested because it floated. So white pine was taken first, red spruce was right on its heels. And so a friend and I went into this old growth forest. I mean, you go in there and there's that big sugar maple I showed you is in this old growth forest. The big pine, the big hemlock, they're all in there. It's not a lot of spruce, not a lot of red spruce. And so we're saying, why isn't there a lot of red spruce in here? And it's probably because it was close to the Saranac River, and they went in, they took the spruce out preferentially, left everything else, floated the red spruce downstream. So now all that's in there are spruce that are maybe 100 years old, because it reverted to forest preserve in the 1890s, mid 1890s. So after that time, nothing was cut. But before that time, the red spruce was harvested out. So now you've got a bunch of old trees, sugar maple, hemlock, yellow birch, white pine, but no big old red spruce.
So what,
Was there originally red spruce in?
We
the-
think there was. We think there was. I mean, the normal Adirondack forest, virgin forest, uncut forest, first growth forest has a component, has a red spruce component. It's a shade tolerant species, so yeah, it should be there. And we think, we don't have any records of people cutting it, and it became forest preserve in the 1890s, but just going in and looking at the land now, you say, geez, why isn't there any red spruce in here? Well, they probably took it. They probably took it.
what's the size girth of the 80, 90, 100-year-old red spruce that has
12 inches, 16 inches, 18 inches. Yeah, 12 inch. Yeah.
100 feet height or?
No, maybe 60 or so, 60, 70.
Well, red spruce would be some of the oldest trees.
Excuse me?
Red spruce would be some of the oldest trees if there are still some.
It does get to great age, yes. Yeah, but again, because it was preferentially cut in the Adirondacks, you gotta go, there are a few places where you can go and see big, really big old red spruce. Most of it is pretty young, 100, 150 years old since the logging stopped.
Was it because of the size of the trees they selected them, or was the wood better?
It's a phenomenal wood, it's light, strong, but it floated. So before they had trains, railroads, they floated the lumber out. So they preferentially took white pine and red spruce because they floated. Hemlock was cut, but to a much lesser extent. In the southern periphery of the Adirondacks, they took hemlock and they cut it, they stripped the bark off of it, they used the bark for tanning lead. They left the wood. The only thing they would use it for is plank roads. So, I mean, they didn't use it for rough cut, like nowadays, I know people who cut hemlock and use rough cut lumber to build sheds out of it, stuff like that. It wasn't very good quality wood to do, building with, not like white pine or red spruce. So that tree was harvested, but only for its bark, and the rest was left to rot in the woods.
How natural is fire as a component of the forest?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, not much. Not central Adirondacks. It's been called the asbestos forest. So, it does burn on occasion, but usually it's around people's houses or clearing or, little ag plots that burn. The big forest fires came through in 2003 and the early 1900s. And those were set, they weren't set on purpose, but they were either lightning strike or they were set by sparks from railroad engines. They were burning coal. And there was a railroad that came up from Utica through Zendera, Old Forge, Big Moose, Tupper Lake, Lake Clear, Saranac Lake, and Lake Placid. And at that time, there was a lot of slash because loggers had gone in and they really cut the forest pretty heavily. And there were slash piles all over the place. Spark came out, touched off these fires that burned extensive parts of the land in 2003 and 2005. And there's a 1916 forest fire map. If you go on that APA website again, Adirondack Park Agency website, go to their map section. I think you can pull that up and see the extent, and remarkably accurate, right, Eileen? We were amazed because it was compiled by forest rangers, not surveyors. It was just guys in Smoky Bear hats, out in the woods, taking notes about what was burned, what wasn't burned. And when we overlaid it and geo referenced it, they did a remarkable job for for the tools they had to work with.
That map also kind of locations where there were supplies and the different kinds of supplies used to fight the fires. It was pretty awesome.
So So let's just continue with the fire theme for a bit. So those are big fires. You go back into those places now, you have young forest, relatively young, 100-year-old hardwood forests and conifer forests, mixed hardwoods and you know, northern hardwoods for the most part. You don't have oak. So, well, it burned. Why don't we have oak? Because oak comes in replaces northern hardwood after centuries of burning, repeated burns. You really got to burn a lot for a long period of time to get the southern hardwoods to move in. The Champlain Valley was a good case for that because the climate was good. It was a little bit warmer. It was a little bit drier, maybe. It was in the rain shadow of the mountains. And we believe that it was burned for a long period of time, large fire for a long period of time. That's why the oak and hickory have moved in.
How would the acorns get there? Was there an acorn owl like the Johnny Appleseed, or
Acorn owl.
or is it birds?
Birds for the most part. Blue jays are big. Squirrels. You know, and these trees, it's amazing, but people have done research on how far oak migrate every year. And I know it's 350 yards a year that they extend themselves. So over centuries,
Dropping their
millennia,
acorns.
yeah, that certainly can. And also, we think, at least in the Catskills, I won't speak about the Adirondacks, but at least in the Catskills, we believe that indigenous peoples planted trees that they wanted, mass trees, white oak, the hickories, things like butternut, things like that. You can go down there and they have located villages, historic villages, native indigenous people's villages. And they're typically on a water body, like a stream, and backing them is the side slope of a mountain, south-facing slope. And you look at those south-facing slopes, it's oak hickory. Go on the north side, it's northern hardwoods. And we think that the archaic people or whoever was there during that time period had a big effect on forest composition.
All right. My next
Madeline.
If someone from online has thoughts on Scotch pine, they can feel free to unmute to explain more. I think they're just wondering, I guess, if Scotch pine is present or.
Yeah.
I don't even know if it's native.
I love Scotch pine, and I'll tell you why. Scotch pine is not native, and it's not invasive either. And if you look at where Scotch pine grows, it's very shade intolerant. It will not grow under the shade of other trees. And so if you look at where it's growing out in open fields, along roadsides, things like that. It was planted back in the 30s and even before that by New York State in the Adirondacks as part of reforestation efforts. They planted Scots pine, red pine, white pine, Norway spruce, and some white spruce. And the Norway obviously was not native, and neither was the Scots pine. Scots pine is the most important timber tree in Northern Europe. Norway spruce is number 2. And they thought that by planting these trees, we'd be doing 2 good things. One is we're buttoning up this land so we stop erosion, but also we've got these 2 species that are great timber trees. Well, they never turned out to be timber trees in North America. The growth form was terrible. Their self-pruning characteristics were lost in translation, so they were never really used for timber. Fast forward these 100 years since Scots pine has been planted here, and if you've got an old field that you want to button up the forest without doing a lot of work, hope that you've got Scots pine growing in your neighbor's field next to you, because Scots pine will colonize a grassy field with no help from you better than white pine or red pine ever thought of doing. Nothing else, white pine needs bare soil. So you'd have to go in, you'd have to scarify the land, pull back the duff, and get the white pine seeds in there. Red pine kind of likes fire to an extent. I wouldn't call it a fire species, but it certainly does reproduce after fires. Scots is the only one that's going to come up through dense turf. And then what happens? It grows for 100, 50 years, then it dies. And what's left? Balsam balsam fir and red maple coming up underneath it. So suddenly you've got a forest again where you had an open field that was maybe not what you wanted. So that's my Scots Pine story.
I think we maybe have time for one more question before we wrap up.
Acid rain, two-part question, kind of passe, and my limited observation tells me the forest had recovered from the mid-century with all the acid rain problem. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm not the person to really answer that question. I can tell you my observations and, what I've read. Yes, acid deposition is not nearly as bad as it was. Although now I guess there's some legislation now, or there litigation now, they're talking, Ohio doesn't want to.
Reversing it.
Yeah. So yes, it is better. The lakes are better. pH levels are better. The Adirondacks are a tough spot because there's no acid, no buffer capacity at all. Soils there are acidic to begin with. They drain really quickly. They're coarse. They're derived from an acidic bedrock. So there wasn't much acid neutralizing capacity in the soils to begin with. But I think it is a lot better.